The Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, and International Financial Institutions will come to order. Without objection, the chairman is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. The hearing is entitled Following the Money, Tools and Techniques to Combat Fraud. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chairman for inclusion in the record. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to welcome our witnesses. Thank you for participating in our hearing today. It's devoted to analyzing investment fraud in the United States and reassessing the effectiveness of tools used to combat fraud in our financial system. Earlier this month, the Federal Trade Commission reported that U.S. consumers lost $5.7 billion to investment scams in 2024. Criminals are increasingly finding ways to bypass U.S. financial regulations in order to scam Americans into draining their life savings for the sake of the criminal's illicit gain. This type of organized fraud transcends both state lines and political divides. These scammers prey on everyday Americans, often our most vulnerable senior citizens. The United States is supposed to have the world's most capable financial intelligence capabilities. We are focused in this committee on national security issues, but we also need to use these resources and capabilities we have more effectively to protect our own citizens. Safety and soundness are essential to preserving our own financial well-being. Beyond our own population, America's capital markets are home to more than half of the world's invested capital, and the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. Since its enactment in 1970, the Bank Secrecy Act has served as the cornerstone for U.S. anti-money laundering, counterterrorism, financing, and know your customer compliance measures for U.S. financial institutions. The Bank Secrecy Act's regulatory framework is intended to defend and secure our financial system from crime. However, considering the ever-changing landscape of technology and financial crime, we must continually assess the effectiveness of the tools and techniques traditionally used to secure the financial system. Today, we'll take time to learn more about investment fraud and how financial institutions, including blockchain analytics firms, contribute to combating this pervasive issue. Investment fraud, as these losses grow in the United States, it's important to consider changes that can be made to enhance the effectiveness of our reporting. Suspicious activity reports, or SARs, and currency transaction reports, CTRs, are tools used by financial institutions to flag transactions over certain monetary value that could be related to illicit activities. These reports are filed by financial institutions and maintained by FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and used by law enforcement agencies over the course of their investigations. A SAR is filed when a financial institution has a transaction over $5,000, and a CTR is filed on cash transactions involving more than $10,000. Based on CPI inflation, $10,000 in 1970 would be more than $81,000 today. These numbers in the reporting requirements have never been adjusted for inflation, so the reporting burden keeps growing with no obvious improvement on the effectiveness of the reports. FinCEN estimated that an average total of 12,600 SARs and 57,000 CTRs were filed each day. This is 2023 data. According to a December 2024 GAO report, law enforcement agencies accessed only 5.4% of those CTRs filed between 2014 and 2013, or 2023. So you got a 10-year period there with data, and only 5.4%. That's not very efficient. It was long overdue for Congress to consider these clearly outdated thresholds and frameworks so that we can protect our people and our financial institutions. Even as we update old laws, it's important to consider other updates. Thankfully, the Trump administration has muted the disastrous and unconstitutional Corporate Transparency Act, requiring businesses to report the beneficial ownership to FinCEN. Presumably, by the law's framework, operating a business or even a homeowners association means you're engaged in illicit finance. But our Constitution says that when the government wants to know private information, they need probable cause, at least reasonable suspicion, to get a warrant or a subpoena. Surely we can minimize the financial harm suffered by Americans exploited by scammers without infringing on their civil liberties or adding ways to make ordinary citizens criminals. As we consider legislative solutions to maximize the effectiveness of our financial intelligence architecture, I'm hopeful that we will increase and improve nationwide education on investment scams, and I'm also hopeful that we'll equip law enforcement agencies with better tools to go after criminals that are continually operating unseen. I look forward to the insights gained on these issues from today's hearing, and I yield back. The chairman now recognizes the ranking member of the committee, Ms. Beatty, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Good morning, and thank you to our witnesses who are here today and for holding this hearing. I want to make sure that we understand today that we really need to have this discussion to combat financial fraud. And it is no secret. We've heard comments from our chair that fraud schemes are on the rise and the bad actors are now finding new and creative ways to defraud consumers. For example, the Federal Trade Commission data showed us that in 2024, American consumers lost more than $12.5 billion to fraud, a 25% increase from the previous year. Our constituents in red and blue districts alike are being robbed of their hard-earned savings, and I'm eager to work with my Republican colleagues to develop sharper tools to deter fraud folks and protect American consumers, starting with today's hearing. Although I appreciate the bipartisan approach to tackling this matter, we cannot ignore the stark contradictions between the goal of today's hearing and the Trump's administration rollback of key financial crime measures that would help us detect and deter fraud. The president, along with Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, is trying to unlawfully eliminate the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the agency, as you know, that's responsible for protecting Americans from fraud and abuse. The president announced that the United States will no longer enforce Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits Americans from bribing foreign officials. And the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, unilaterally announced that the department will not be enforcing the Bipartisan Corporate Transparency Act, which President Trump signed into law during his first term against U.S. persons, exempting over 99% of the companies Congress intended the law to cover. Gutting the CTA eliminates a critical tool for law enforcement to detect and deter fraud cases that involve anonymous shell companies, effectively making the United States a haven for money launderers, traffickers, and fraudsters. Let me just give you an example. In 2022, 6 individuals were charged with scamming over 20,000 victims by tricking them into paying for tech repair services. Victims paid more than $10 million. I'm going to say that again. Victims paid more than $10 million to bank accounts tied to a network of shell companies. While I join my colleagues on the other side in calling out the need for key beneficial ownership reforms, the administration repeatedly chooses to gut the law entirely instead of working in a bipartisan manner to ease small business compliance burdens. In just 2 months, President Trump has made it easier for financial fraud to devastate hard-working families, particularly older adults, by unlawfully dismantling the pillars of our financial crime regulatory regime. While I, again, appreciate this hearing, I hope the discussion only underscores the vital significance of this regime and the need to preserve it if we were truly to prevent fraud and protect our constituents. And once again, to our witnesses, I hope that you can shed some light on this, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Davidson and Ranking Member Beatty, for convening this hearing on fraud. U.S. fraud losses were estimated at nearly $13 billion in 2023. But many think the actual amount is much higher, especially for the 100 million Americans over age 50. Fraud is a serious threat to their secure retirement and well-being. Congress must take financial crime seriously. It must stand up for the tools it enacted, like the Bank Secrecy Act and Corporate Transparency Act, to detect fraud and hold fraudsters accountable. Congress must stand up for the bank examiners, investigators, prosecutors, agencies, and consumers that are under attack by the Trump regime and his billionaire cabinet. And we must end Trump's own schemes to defraud the American public using his meme coin and stable coin. I thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Today we welcome the testimony of Mr. Darren McLaughlin. He's the Executive Vice President and Chief BSA, AML, and Sanctions Officer for Flagstar Bank in Michigan, and he's testifying on behalf of the American Bankers Association. Ms. Jacqueline Burns-Coven is the Head of Cyber Threat Intelligence at Chainalysis. Mr. Jeff Brabant is the Vice President for Federal Government Relations at the National Federation of Independent Businesses. And Ms. Kathy Stokes is the Director of Fraud Prevention for the AARP. We thank each of you for taking time to be here. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. McLaughlin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral statement.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Chairman Davidson, Ranking Member Beatty, Ranking Member Waters, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Darren McLaughlin, and I am the EVP and Chief BSA AML Officer for Flagstar based in New York. I am testifying today on behalf of the American Bankers Association. These views are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of my employer. Criminal enterprises are targeting all Americans. 1 in 3 adults have experienced a financial fraud or a scam in just the last 12 months, while nearly 2 in 5 have experienced a financial loss. Bad actors have leveraged cutting-edge technology, social media, and telecommunications to target American life savings. Through increasingly sophisticated techniques, bad actors make false promises of huge financial returns on fictitious investment opportunities. I represent the thousands of talented BSA and anti-fraud professionals across the country who have dedicated their entire careers to protecting their customers and the U.S. financial system. But our customers are still under attack. To succeed, we need a more strategic approach that includes the government, the banking industry, and other industries across the economy. It is critical that the banking industry receives transparent and actionable feedback from the government and important regulatory reforms to let us focus on the real threats. I would like to emphasize 3 things today. First, banks are doing important work to combat fraud, including leveraging technology, continuously improving anti-fraud operations, and investing in customer anti-fraud education. But a whole-of-government approach is needed. Financial institutions across the country have implemented rigorous risk-based AML compliance and anti-fraud programs that alert us to signs customers have started to send money in unusual patterns. Unfortunately, these customers sometimes fall victims to those overseas characters. We can share heartbreaking stories across the industry about innocent customers who have lost their lifetime savings to investment scams. As hard as we try, sometimes we cannot convince our customers that they are the victim of a scam in progress. Although we file suspicious activity reports with Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, by the time law enforcement receives the report, it is often too late. A major part of this threat comes from overseas, and these bad actors are using new generative AI tools to increase the sophistication and effectiveness of their outreach. There must be a better approach to tackling this grave problem. Greater involvement by and coordination with the government is essential. Second, Banks need timely, actionable data and feedback from the government on priority threats. The federal government has a database bursting with threat information which should be shared with the private sector. Although thousands of SARs are filed, they may not actually reflect criminal or other illicit acts. It would help banks to see analysis of these reports and other information the government may have about this illicit activity. Finally, we need meaningful reforms in the BSA rules, including creating a true risk-based approach to BSA AML compliance, provide transparent government feedback to banks regarding priority threats, reform of outdated currency transaction reporting, streamline and update the suspicious activity and other reporting forms that we must complete, and increase collaboration between bank regulators and the banks. In conclusion, banks are working hard to combat fraud, but it is clear our customers are still under attack. To fight back and succeed, we need a whole-of-government approach that includes greater transparency and actionable feedback from the government. We need other sectors to do their part, and we need important regulatory reforms to let us focus on the real threats. Chairman Davids, Ranking Member Beatty, and Ranking Member Waters, and members of the subcommittee, we are grateful for your leadership in holding this hearing to highlight the extraordinary and growing financial fraud problem that is plaguing our country. We look forward to working with you and your colleagues to explore what Congress, the regulatory agencies, and the federal government can do to help. Thank you once again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. McLaughlin. Ms. Burns-Coven, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral statement.
Chairman Davidson, Ranking Member Beatty, Ranking Member Waters, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify before you today on the pressing issue of fraud targeting Americans. My name is Jacqueline Burns-Coven, and I'm the head of cyber threat intelligence for the blockchain data platform Chainalysis, where we help make blockchain safer and more secure so that financial institutions, businesses, and governments can engage cryptocurrency with confidence. Leveraging the blockchain's inherent transparency, we track cryptocurrency activity by illicit actors, such as those engaged in scams, and provide data on their financial activity to private and public sector customers. Today's hearing shines an important spotlight on scams facing the American people as a matter of national security. Most notably, so-called pig butchering scams, also referred to as investment or confidence scams, that target and build relationships with individuals, convincing them to invest in fraudulent opportunities. Scam syndicates are well-resourced. According to Chainalysis data, for each of the past 4 years, scam operators received over $10 billion in cryptocurrency payments, with 2024 estimated as a record year. It has never been easier for scammers to access tools to make the con more convincing and scalable. The peer-to-peer marketplace, Hui1 Guarantee, for example, has become a one-stop shop for the scam supply chain. As we highlighted in our annual crypto crime report, Hui1 has processed more than $70 billion in crypto transactions, and its infrastructure facilitates laundering services as well as the sale of contact information for outreach to potential scam victims, web hosting services, social and media accounts, and AI software. Fraudsters can always be counted on to abuse novel technologies for their aims, but the utilization of cryptocurrency should fundamentally place scammers at a disadvantage. Cryptocurrency transactions are inherently public, and the data from those transactions is preserved on a transparent, immutable ledger. In fact, stablecoins in particular are freezable midstream, which has led to spectacular seizures of scammed funds. Blockchain intelligence provides insight into the entire scam supply chain, laundering patterns, and even the scale, at a level unparalleled in traditional finance. Indeed, a single cryptocurrency payment to a scam can often lead to identifying hundreds of other victim payments of a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, allowing for a more effective disruption and restitution efforts rather than just one-off criminal investigations. However, the current reality is that scammers are exploiting the siloed nature of how the public and private sector identify and respond to these schemes. Scammer syndicates are organized and agile, and they are capitalizing on our visibility gaps. Today, scam victims have multiple state, local, and federal agencies they can report to, yet there's no easy mechanism for these agencies to share with each other, let alone with the private sector best positioned to prevent additional victims. and financial institutions reporting on scams have no visibility into the scams reported by their peers, leaving them unable to protect their customers from scams known to the government or to the financial institution next door. At the same time, private sector entities outside of financial institutions on the front line of scams lack the structures to comprehensively share and receive information from public sector about scam activity that would allow them to take more proactive measures. It is essential to modernize and streamline bidirectional scam reporting and response between public and private sectors to facilitate restitution and the prevention of additional victims. Furthermore, too often scam victims are turned away from local authorities who are ill-equipped to properly assist crypto cases. We must ensure law enforcement's access to blockchain analysis and training and invest in tech-driven efficiency to swiftly action intelligence and seize funds. Over the past 10 years, Chainalysis has supported hundreds of cases involving the freezing of assets in partnership with government agencies worldwide, helping to secure at least $12.6 billion worth of illicit crypto. It is imperative that we develop strategies to prevent Americans from falling prey to scams altogether. Chainalysis acquired Alteria, which utilizes artificial intelligence to identify early-stage scam activities, enabling financial institutions large-scale upstream detection. We further support a regulatory framework that clearly delineates responsibility for oversight of businesses offering stablecoins and trading services. Finally, we need to close gaps in AML-CFT standards implementation, and in the absence of cooperation, more pressure is needed to disrupt financial networks, defying laws and regulatory norms. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide testimony on this important topic. I'm encouraged by the subcommittee's interest, and to that end, we invite Congress's continued engagement on this topic to combat scams and better protect Americans. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for that. Mr. Braben, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral statement.
Chairman Davidson, Ranking Member Beatty, Ranking Member Waters, and the members of the House Committee on Financial Services, thank you for allowing me to testify before the committee today. My name is Jeff Brabant, and I am the Vice President of Federal Government Relations for the National Federation of Independent Business. NFIB is the voice of small business in Washington, D.C., all 50 state capitals, and the nation's courts. We represent about 300,000 small business owners, with the average NFIB member employing about 7 to 8 people. Data privacy is a significant concern for small business owners. A prime example of this is the Corporate Transparency Act. Under the CTA, small businesses with fewer than 20 employees and $5 million in revenue are required to report their beneficial ownership information to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. This includes a scanned copy of a driver's license or passport of every beneficial owner. Federal, state, local, and international law enforcement and intelligence agencies can access this information without a subpoena or warrant. Small businesses fear their information will be targeted by criminals, politically motivated individuals, or subject to cyber attacks by our nation's adversaries that could expose their personal information to actual criminals and nefarious actors. Some small businesses have fallen victim to companies, which may be scam operators, offering to file BOI data. A recent search of CTA BOI filing on Google demonstrates this problem. 3 sponsored BOI companies appear before the official FinCEN result. One of these companies in particular, BOIR.org, even uses an imitation government seal with an eagle on it to appear like an official one. Small businesses overwhelmingly oppose the CTA. Thankfully, President Trump recognized the absurdity of beneficial ownership information reporting requirements. He called the law invasive, outrageous, and an economic menace. He could not be more right. The ultimate irony is that a law that supporters claim is for national security has likely opened the U.S. economy, American citizens, and small business owners to more data and privacy risk. The federal database will be breached, it will be hacked, and private information will leak. This is why Congress and Treasury must immediately and permanently delete the records of the millions of U.S. small business owners who already filed their BOI with FinCEN. This is non-negotiable. It has to be destroyed. Let me be clear. The CTA is unconstitutional and should be overturned by the courts. Absent intervention from the courts, Congress can clean this mess up by passing Chairman Davidson's Repealing Big Brother Overreach Act. This legislation would repeal the CTA so a future administration could not revive or expand the statute. Congress could also exempt law-abiding U.S. small businesses from the CTA, as the Trump administration has proposed. Before I close, I would like to draw attention to the issue of IP and identity theft by fraudulent as well as legitimate Chinese businesses such as Temu. NFIB members have shared stories of how their popular American-made products are being stolen and ripped off by Chinese companies. One of the more egregious examples is of the Illinois-based and American-made Power Planter. Power Planter is a garden auger manufacturer that works in standard cordless drills. This small business has been the target of nonstop IP and identity theft by Chinese scammer companies. These companies will copy and paste Power Planter's copywritten images, verbiage, and advertising imagery, including their Made in America claim, and sell it from China at a lower cost. The Chinese product is of inferior quality, and when it breaks, consumers don't even realize it is from China and often complain directly to Power Planter, even leaving negative comments on their social media pages. Power Planter has dedicated significant resources to trying to stop these scammers, but it's a full-time job. In fact, this small business has been forced to retain counsel whose job is to track rip-off companies on sites like Amazon, Alibaba, and eBay, and report them to the appropriate company for removal. There have been instances where Power Planter's counsel has removed several thousand such imposters in a single month. The process of getting the scam company taken down often takes several attempts, and even then, there is often a remedial process where they are allowed to begin selling again, or another company pops right back up and is an endless game of whack-a-mole. These fraudulent companies are taking money out of the pockets of American businesses and workers. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the impact of scams and fraud on small business, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Braben. Ms. Stokes, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral statement.
Thank you and good morning. My name is Kathy Stokes and I'm the Director of Fraud Prevention Programs for AARP. Thanks for inviting me to testify on behalf of AARP at this important hearing. This morning I'm going to shed light on the true impact of fraud, its potential to victimize anyone, and its significant threat to national security. Through the Fraud Watch Network, AARP educates older adults on the risk that fraud poses to their financial security, meeting them where they are. We have hundreds of volunteers that work with our state offices and communities all over the country to help older Americans avoid fraud. We share information online through newsletters and a podcast, and we cover fraud in most editions of our publications that tens of millions of Americans receive. Our victim support program, including a helpline receiving 500 calls daily and support groups that address fraud's emotional impact, helps people like Dave, who lost family and friends and contemplated suicide after having his home and his business stolen from him through a romance scam. The recent growth in fraud has been meteoric, but the FTC estimates underreporting, suggesting real fraud losses in 2023 were not the reported $10.4 billion, but $158.3 billion. And criminals do not discriminate on who they target, but when older adults are victimized, the financial impact can be catastrophic. These people are financially ruined, they experience emotional and health impacts, often their families are torn apart, and many once financially secure Americans who did the right thing and saved for a comfortable retirement are left to rely on government safety nets. In my written testimony, I describe how the sophistication and scale of today's transnational crime rings have led to them becoming a national security threat. These enterprises leverage a vast array of tools to commit their crimes, including all methods of communication and forms of payment, complex impersonation schemes, anonymous shell companies, human trafficking, and more. Take the Jalisco New Generation Cartel in Mexico. It's using scams to fund things like sending meth and fentanyl across our southern border. Or take the massive explosion of financial grooming schemes, the origins of which are Chinese organized crime in Southeast Asia. Their goal? To cripple the US economy. The reason scams succeed beyond sophistication and scale relies on how our brains work. Criminals know that they can force our brains to bypass logic by getting targets into a heightened emotional state. Criminals call it getting targets under the ether, and academics have shed light on the actual science behind it. Linda, a professor, shared her story with AARP about the day her life was turned upside down when a tech support scam that started with a fear-inducing computer pop-up message led to a 4.5-month nightmare that forced her retirement and saw her buying gold bars and putting them into a stranger's car. When she realized the crime, she said it was like the walls of her house blew down. Now, there's no single solution to the fraud crisis. It will take a whole of society approach. For individuals, it's things like better protecting ourselves, freezing our credit, using password managers and multi-factor authentication. For educators, it's focusing on the red flags that are important, but so is training on how most scams come at us and what to do when they do. For industry, financial institutions must continue to innovate on fraud mitigation. Tech companies must build safety and security into product design and manufacturing. Telcos must find a way for stopping the scams over the networks from reaching Americans. And industry and law enforcement must work together. AARP is a founder of a new public-private partnership called the National Elder Fraud Coordination Center, and we will enhance the ability for private industry and the public space to work together to begin to solve elder fraud crimes. At AARP, we are looking forward to working with policymakers to address fraud by supporting resources for state and local law enforcement to hire and train staff and secure tools that combat the fraud crimes, improved fraud reporting systems so law enforcement can prioritize cases, reinstating the casualty and theft loss deduction to address the taxation of stolen assets, legislation to limit the damage of crypto ATMs, and supporting the National Elder Fraud Coordination Center. You can learn more about that at fightelderfraud.org. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of our witnesses. We learned a lot just from your opening statements, and wow, what a challenge. We'll now turn to member questions. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. Mr. McLaughlin, based on your 27 years of experience, have you seen an expansion of the efforts to stop fraud?
Thank you for your question, Chairman. Over 27 years, yes, there's been a huge emphasis on protecting our customers in the industry. We have tackled this via enhancing our education programs, via workshops in our branches, educational material posted on our websites.
So your own efforts in the industry, but also you've seen more regulatory pressure to disclose and report, correct?
Correct. Yes, the increased significance or pressure placed on financial institutions to identify and report suspicious activity and fraud has grown over the course of the last 27 years.
So as the number of fraud cases and the size and scope of the fraud also increased?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so in a way, it's like, well, in spite of our effort, we haven't really stopped it. We haven't necessarily shrunk it either. And some would say, well, gosh, imagine how bad it would be if we hadn't been doing these things. But on the other hand, maybe the way we're going about it isn't working. So could you highlight what you think works and what maybe could be done more effectively from your experience?
Thank you again. From my experience, what has been working is the increased investment within the public sector on education, on advanced technologies to catch the fraud at the front door, as we call it, before they're able to transact with the institutions. Also advancements in the models and scenarios for which we monitor customer behavior once that account is established. What we could be doing better, I would say, is establishing that relationship, that public-private relationship where there's a flow of information back and forth between the government and the regulated financial institutions that I represent. The government sits on a mountain of data from the hundreds of thousands of SARs that have filed and CTRs that have filed, as well as the prosecutions that law enforcement.
Do they normally get back to you? I mean, here's a case. I'm working on weaponization committee last Congress. One bank was asked by the FBI to report on their customers, and the bank said, we need a warrant or a subpoena. Then the FBI came back and said, well, why don't you generate a suspicious activity report where none had previously existed? Is that kind of interaction with law enforcement normal?
Yes, the financial services and the financial institutions that I've had the honor of working for do have good relationships with law enforcement. However, to protect the laws and the regulations that the financial institutions fall under, we do often, after conversations with law enforcement, request a subpoena to turn over information. Now, it's unusual to receive that type of conversation where a SAR wasn't filed, but usually once the SAR is filed, outreach begins and conversations and flow of data starts happening.
Well, thank you for that, and I look forward to working with you all and colleagues to make our system more effective. And I just want to highlight, Mr. Brabant, I appreciate your testimony because not only are individuals being scammed, but businesses are, and especially small businesses. You referenced a bill, the Repealing Big Brother Overreach Act. It's got 133 House co-sponsors and identical legislation sponsored by Senator Tubbsville in the Senate. In the change that you referenced that the Trump administration's done by focusing beneficial ownership reporting requirements on foreign-owned entities, is that an improvement for American citizens?
I think absolutely an improvement for American citizens and an improvement for American small businesses. When you're looking at 32.6 million reports FinCEN is expecting in year one, that is not a risk-based approach. That is a needle in a haystack approach. And when you refine it down to a smaller, more risk-based approach, it should be a win.
Yeah, I appreciate you also referencing what we need to do with the existing data. So thank you for that. And look, Ms. Stokes, I really appreciate your emphasis on seniors and the great work you've done to educate seniors. Working with our county prosecutors, do you have a way to roll that toolkit out through member offices so we make sure that our county prosecutors who are on the front lines, they often feel unsupported by federal resources. So in your experience, what you're seeing, are these like lone actors trying to scam people, or is it sort of an organized crime effort that's hitting individuals and businesses?
Thank you for that question, Representative. For a long time, we've all held this assumption that the fraudster is some guy in his mom's basement making phone calls and lurking on social media. And I'm sure those guys are still out there, but they're not the ones that are causing the majority of the problem. This is transnational.
Thank you. I wish I had longer, but my time has expired, and I hope you can respond in writing. Sorry I didn't leave you enough time there. My time has expired, and I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Beatty, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll continue with Ms. Stokes. I think we all touched on this earlier, but I'd like to go a little deeper into it. The Bipartisan Corporate Transparency Act, as you know, was created to prevent bad actors from hiding behind anonymous shell companies. And can you clearly lay out for us how this relates to fraud prevention and how the CTA and the beneficial ownership database would be a critical fraud prevention tool?
Thank you, Representative Beatty, for that question. I think that, I have a lot of opportunity to interact with law enforcement, financial crimes investigators, and I understand from them how critical information is that will help them get to the bottom of the cases. And anything that takes away from that would be a challenge. And, the tools that criminals use are vast. They're, complex impersonation schemes and fake websites, shell companies, human trafficking. There's so many crimes within this crime.
Maybe you can answer this as a follow-up. Can you address how Treasury's recent decision to exempt more than 99% of the companies that Congress intended to cover will weaken our fraud prevention efforts?
Thank you, Representative. I can say that anything that is going to reduce information that can be actionable by law enforcement from our perspective when it comes to fraud, that is, it's a crisis, is very problematic.
Okay. Mr. McLaughlin, let me ask you this. It's been mentioned several times already this morning that fraud is rapidly on the rise from you, from my colleagues. Each year, American consumers, as we know, are reporting significantly greater financial losses to scams. And we clearly need to take, I believe, a whole of government approach to tackling this problem. And I understand that there are several federal and state and local organizations that play various roles in addressing fraud. But there is currently no one central location for fraud victims to seek help. Can you shed some light on or explain the current disjointed framework and any suggestions you would have for us in Congress that we can instate a streamlined, user-friendly process for fraud victims to report these crimes to?
Thank you for your question, Ranking Member. So currently in the industry, we work with several non-for-profits that focus on this, including AARP and other well-established anti-fraud groups. At the local and state and federal law enforcement level, we also interact because we all believe that this is something that's growing that we need to tackle. So there are working groups that are established. There are conferences that are held where the idea sharing occurs. There's also a greater need for transparency in the actual anti-fraud movement. When financial institutions in the public sector file suspicious activity reports or file with the Adult Protective Services when it comes to elder exploitation, there's very little time do we get feedback on the information that we provided to see if it was actionable for those agencies. So the sharing of knowledge back and forth would allow us to actually target specific threats to our customers and our population. So centralizing a fraud group within law enforcement or a regulatory agency would give our customers a central point of contact, but also allow the financial institutions as well to have a central point of contact to continuously build upon the programs that we have.
Okay. I might have enough time for either one of you to give us any insight on how fraudsters are using social media platforms to lure victims in. Ms. Stokes, Mr. McLaughlin, anything on that?
Thank you for that question. Yes, social media is one of the biggest vectors for fraud, and we see so much harm coming from them, yet we don't see a concerted effort to take down the social media profiles that are there and are known to be related to scams, and a lot more needs to be done by that industry to...
My time is almost up. Yes or no, is that something that Congress should be looking into, you believe?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Oklahoma, also the chairman of the Task Force on Monetary Policy, Mr. Lucas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for testifying today. In my regular meetings with bankers across my home state, the issue of fraud is one that often comes up. They're on the ground, they're seeing the people in their community being taken advantage of. It's unfortunate then that oftentimes federal agencies place reporting burdens on our financial institutions rather than trying to get it through to the problem. Mr. McLaughlin, how does it affect your communities, our communities I should say, when our credit providers have to spend all their time complying with what some might define as burdensome reporting requirements?
So we have finite resources available to us within the public financial institution sector. So when increased burden is placed on us, we have to make certain risk-based decisions as to where to deploy those resources, where to spend money on our investments in technology and other operational efficiencies that we can garner to continuously focus on the mission of catching as many bad guys as we possibly can. So when we get more burden in terms of more checkbox exercises, that just means we have to expend more resources to tackle the job.
If I could follow up on that question, oftentimes our credit providers are the first to notice when something goes wrong. And I recently met with bankers again in my district that told me countless stories of how they were able to identify fraudulent activities and protect their customers. Bankers are allies in detecting fraud, but they're not responsible for enforcing the law, and they shouldn't be asked to do so by the federal government. So, Mr. McLaughlin, could you expand on how could we support our financial institutions that are targeted by these crimes?
I'm going to go back to, and thank you for your question, I'm going to go back to the transparency between local, state, federal law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and FinCEN. the access to data and allowing the smart individuals that we have working for us and data scientists across all sectors, allowing us to analyze the data to focus on the threat at hand instead of having us focus on check-the-box exercises that many financial institutions face today would be a huge step forward.
Turning to you, Mr. Brabant, I've heard again from a number of my small businesses across Oklahoma that are worried about the increased administrative burden that many reporting requirements place on them. And small businesses, by definition, have fewer resources to devote to these lengthy and elaborate reporting regimes. Can you talk about the harms of overly broad reporting mechanisms? How to do rulemakings like the previous administration's rule on beneficial ownership actually hurt our efforts to stop fraud?
Yeah, when something's overly broad, it's extremely challenging. For example, you have the substantial control prong in the definition, which is essentially defined as substantial control. The previous administration defined it so broadly to be senior staff. So if you're a restaurant manager and you have no ownership stake, you probably have substantial control. One of the challenges when you're a small business owner is, well, what senior staff do I have to put in? FinCEN doesn't clearly define this, so you're worried about going to jail for 2 years because you might not have put enough senior staffers in. And it's a real challenge, and then you have to ask yourself, how pertinent is this information that's being reported that has sometimes just staff out there with no ownership control at all?
Ms. Burns-Coven, you've worked in this industry from various vantage points and have seen the ebbs and flows of the financial crime operators. What trends are you seeing today in financial fraud, and how can we perhaps try to get ahead of this industry, so to speak?
Thank you for that question. I think we've seen broadly that illicit actors of all stripes, whether that be fraudsters, drug traffickers, are using jurisdictions with weak AML-CFT standards. They're looking for those paths of least resistance. So in closing those gaps in capacity building or even applying pressures to jurisdictions willingly being blind to the use of their platforms for laundering, we can better identify and prevent these illicit actors from reaping the rewards of their activities.
Mr. Chairman, let me simply say in closing, consumers are feeling it, financial institutions are feeling it, fraudsters do not discriminate when it comes to who they steal from. And we need to focus on that problem and give our law enforcement tools what it needs to stop these criminals rather than just more paperwork. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentlewoman from California, also the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members. I'm about to ask the question about a particular situation in this country that is hardly believable. But I'm pleased that we're here talking about follow the money, tools and techniques to combat fraud. Now, here's some money I want us to follow. Ms. Stokes, days before Donald Trump took office, he introduced a meme coin, dedicated, of course, to himself, while the entities behind his Trump meme coin earned nearly $100 million in trading fees in less than 2 weeks. Hundreds of thousands of small traders suffered $2 billion in losses over the same time frame. Days after he released his coin, Melania Trump issued her own coin. The many concerns about this aren't only that the Trump family profits, or how this venture has become the biggest component of the president's personal wealth, more than even the real estate for which he's known. It raises questions about the use of cryptocurrency, including meme coins, to entice, to fleece, to defraud people out of their hard-earned savings. Further, at the same time that Donald Trump is offering his meme coin and other cryptocurrency products to enrich himself, his regime is considering the rules that will define how cryptocurrency is regulated. They're in charge. It also comes at a time when Trump and Republicans are working hard to lower, even to remove barriers to fraud and financial crime. As an expert in fraud prevention, How do criminals use cryptocurrency to commit fraud, especially that which targets older Americans? Why is cryptocurrency so attractive to the bad guys? And how do the perpetrators, such as transnational criminal organizations, make crypto appealing to the victim? And by the way, not only has the president created this coin, Mimi coin, he's also involved with the company on stable coins, because we're negotiating stable coins right now. In the middle of our negotiations, he's creating his own company on stable coin. What's going on?
Well, thank you for that question, Representative Waters. I do know that when cryptocurrency is in the news, the criminals follow. So this does create tremendous opportunity because general, everyday Americans don't really understand what crypto is. They don't understand that its value is simply based on supply and demand. So the investments can seem really attractive. We're seeing two ways that crypto is showing up in the fraud space. One is crypto investment schemes where people are having everything stolen from them. That is the goal of the criminals, to steal every penny from every victim. And the other is the use of crypto ATM machines. You probably see 12,000 of them around the country. They're in vape businesses and grocery stores, and the criminals are convincing the victim of an urgent matter that they have to address, and they have to go to the bank, they take out wads of cash, and then they walk over to these crypto ATM machines, and they put $100 at a time into these machines, taking sometimes hours, which is risk in and of itself, and then they send the money to who they think is going to help them, and it goes into the wallet of a criminal.
Wow. Well, thank you. Let me move on. We know that anonymous shell companies are a common tool used by fraudsters to facilitate their crimes and to launder the proceeds of their bad act. For example, 2 Chinese nationals were arrested for allegedly leading a scheme to launder $73 million in proceeds from cryptocurrency investment scams. The victims transferred millions of dollars to U.S. bank accounts opened in the names of over 70 U.S. shell companies whose apparent purpose was to launder the proceeds of the fraud. Similarly, the leader of a large-scale timeshare resale scam was sentenced to prison for defrauding more than 1,000 victims, many of them elderly, out of their millions using a network of fake front companies in cities across the country. This examples abound, and I would like to submit for the record a fact sheet from the Transparency International U.S. that describes how these corporate entities registered in the United States are abused for a range of fraudulent purposes. The Trump regime, with the help of my colleagues across the aisle, are trying to make such fraud schemes easier by gutting the Corporate Transparency Act, which helps the government unmask who truly owns or controls these shell companies. Enough, enough, enough. And I know
Without
I don't have
objection,
any more time. I yield back.
I'll accept the gentlewoman's submission without objection. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Before we go too far, I want to acknowledge the gentleman, the Honorable Jack Fields, former member of our Texas delegation, who was the ranking member of Energy and Commerce when he retired in 1996, is with us today. And Mr. Fields, I want to thank you. You've been a guardian of moving America forward for a long time, and I think as you watch what's going on and have since you've left, you've seen where the things that got developed also have a downside to them, an underbelly that we're speaking about today. I want to, if I can, go to anybody in the panel. I've read the testimony and also the things which we have prepared, Mr. Davidson's great staff, about the overview. And increasingly what comes out today is we have a problem. And I think we have seen and heard this. What has federal law enforcement done to mirror up to try and stop this? I know there are working groups. We heard there's a national elder fraud, a task force you're trying to gather together as an industry. What agency is the lead that you would look to? Anybody?
I'll take a first stab at that, and thank you for your question, sir. From a financial institution standpoint, we would interact with local or federal agencies within the state that we found the fraud.
Can
So
you name that?
Yeah.
So in other words, I know that the SEC or
it depends on-
FINRA has jurisdiction over looking at transactions and data and information. When you had something that you consider to be a crime, who do you look for? Who is the lead agency?
Again, thank you for your question. It depends on the fraud that we're seeing. So if we're seeing check or financial fraud, we would contact the Secret Service in some cases because they sit within the Department of Treasury and have that exposure. We're talking elder abuse, financial exploitation. We would reach out to APS and or the FBI or within the city or state that the crime's taken place.
Have we, as members of Congress, through the law, made it clear to not just consumers, but really the industry about have we streamlined that? Do you know who to go to in a given circumstance?
Thank you for the question. I think more can be done to streamline reporting and modernize it so that we can connect the dots from a one-off investigation to understanding that entire scheme so that we can actually increase recovery and restitution and make more victims whole. We've had spectacular seizures by U.S. government of cryptocurrency assets. Chainalysis has worked with governments around the world seizing over $12.6 billion worth of illicit crypto, but more needs to be done to upskill and train at the state and local level to ensure those departments that are the first line of response oftentimes for victims are well equipped to understand and act quickly to pursue these cases and seize those funds.
Well, I'm well aware that many U.S. attorneys and other agencies within law enforcement want to look at minimums. It's not big enough for them until it gets to a certain stature. And I've heard testimony, which I believe is true, unless you go and plug a circumstance and challenge someone, they're going to continue these things. And I think that it's important that what the chairman is doing here, that we do pass this piece of legislation that I got on yesterday. But we also have to have that translate to the Department of Justice, to law enforcement, that actually we honor them and ask them to please understand more about this. I think as they look at the crime, they also see what might be called MOs, method of operations, of how people do this, that then the feedback comes to you, which was talked about. We fill out these reports and we don't hear anything back. We're not sure whether what we're providing is enough information, whether it was specific information. And I think some success stories would go a long way to do that. I think that I'd love to have this subcommittee delve into that angle of what we need to do better to incent law enforcement to want to do that, whether it's us paying attention or gathering things together. I want to thank you, Warren, for doing this hearing. I think it's most instructive about our job as members of Congress to warn people, in particular seniors. I yield back my time, Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and the gentleman from California, who's also the ranking member of the Task Force on Monetary Policy, Mr. Vargas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. And I also thank the ranking member. And I also thank the witnesses. Thank you for being here today. I think it's been very, very informative. I do have to call out, though, right at the beginning, when a lot of my colleagues on the other side like to talk about unconstitutionality or illegal acts, it's funny that none of them seem to call out the executive orders of President Trump. In fact, interestingly, a Republican-appointed judge, Judge John Koffner, said this, that one of the orders is blatantly unconstitutional. Because I have a difficulty understanding how a member of the bar could state unequivocally that this is a constitutional order. It boggles the mind. And again, I think it's important to call that out because I know we've heard time and time again, since I've been here, the CFPB is an illegal bureau. It went all this way to the Supreme Court, and certainly the Supreme Court didn't agree with my colleagues. And so I think that has to be called out. So I call it out. I do want to ask this. There seems to be a contradiction in what some of you have been saying today. It's interesting. If you listen to what some of you said, says the government has a whole bunch of information and they ought to give it to us. And sometimes in real time so we can help them solve this fraud problem. And then I hear from somebody else saying the government has too much information, and this information, in fact, could be hacked, and then that would be very detrimental to us. I mean, it seems that that's what I heard. Did I not hear that? I mean, let me go first to Mr. Brabant. I mean, it sounded to me like you were saying you're not confident with some of the information the government holds.
Yeah, absolutely. If the beneficial ownership information database went forward, it'd have over 32 million driver's license photocopies of small business owners, which would make it a hacker's dream to get that information from an identity theft perspective.
Right. In fact, we see right now a lot of the complaints that we're getting about Doge is they're trying to get into people's private information that no one knows why they need it. And then it seems, and not for a negative purpose, you guys want to stop fraud, but it seems like you're saying the federal government has a whole bunch of information, and we'd like to have it in real time so we can stop this fraud. Well, it seems like it potentially could be a massive invasion of privacy. How do you reconcile that? Yes.
Thank you for the question. You know, the folks that I represent, the thousands of dedicated anti-money laundering and fraud professionals, care for our customers' data just as much as everybody else in the industry. However, we have a responsibility to our customers to collect data and collect illicit threats on our customers to do things like transaction monitoring.
Well, no one disagrees with that. But I have to tell you, I come from the perspective that I think banks try to do the right thing with this information. I don't think they want their clients to be defrauded. I don't believe that at all. I think you guys are trying hard. But I'm not one of these guys that thinks the government is the bad people either. I think the government attempts to do the right things too. Sometimes it falters like anybody else. But it does seem like you're asking for a lot of information, private information, that a lot of people would have a problem with you having, especially, in fact, I'm kind of surprised some of my colleagues on the other side didn't call that out. They're usually pretty good about this privacy stuff. But I mean, it seems like you're saying, hey, give us a whole bunch of this information back. I mean, isn't there a conflict there?
Again, thank you for the question. It's not a conflict from the financial crimes perspective. We, as financial institutions, collect a lot of sensitive information on our customers already to establish a reasonable belief in that customer's identity. The information I'm looking to, and my folks in my industry are looking to partner with, is a secure transmission of information that has been used in a financial crime outside of the institution that we are employed by.
No, I get that. I get that. The government has a lot of information. You'd like some of that too. And I mean, I don't know. It seems to me that could be a massive invasion of privacy. I'm surprised that my colleagues on the other side haven't called that out. I do want to say one thing, though. You talked about the financial fraud with the farmer. If the CFPB was still in order, we could still go after that. In fact, right now when they're calling about fraud, no one answers the damn phone. So we have elderly people, we have people in the military, veterans in San Diego that call the CFPB, and there's nobody on the other side of the line. And that's a problem. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Texas, also the chairman of the Small Business Committee, Mr. Williams, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Ms. Burns-Coben, we are seeing an evolution in how fraud is being committed and concealed, particularly through the use of emerging technologies like decentralized exchanges and cryptocurrencies. These tools are not only being exploited by traditional scammers behind investment funds and pig butchering schemes, but increasingly by sophisticated transnational criminal organizations, including Mexican drug cartels that are adapting their tactics to evade the detection. In many cases, these groups are bleeding fraud proceeds with other illicit revenue streams and using crypto infrastructure to obscure the origin and flow of funds. Now, from your advantage, what trends are you seeing in how fraudsters, both individual and organized, are using these technologies to evade AML controls? And how is your organization working with the private sector and law enforcement to stay ahead of these evolving threats and ensuring we can continue to track down these criminals effectively?
Thank you for the question. And we're able to track these cartels purchasing fentanyl precursors from Chinese dealers who are primarily operating in cryptocurrency. We're seeing illicit actors adopt cryptocurrency for the same reason it's being used for legitimate purposes, because it's stable, it's liquid, it's fast. Any technology we can count on fraudsters to abuse. And luckily, we've been able to track some of these fentanyl dealers and Mexican cartels, but they're early stage in cryptocurrency, and they are not expert launderers, which provides excellent opportunity for intervention. I want to highlight the Eastern District of Wisconsin for forfeiting $5.5 million in cryptocurrency associated with cartels and Chinese fentanyl precursor dealers. So there's a number of cases where we see this over and over at the federal and state and local level, and we need to make sure that the state and local investigators are equipped to be able to identify and track these payments.
Okay, thank you. One particular area of concern of mine is how government-related reporting requirements such as FinCEN's beneficial ownership information rule may be putting small businesses and their owners at risk. The rollout of BOI reporting under the Corporate Transparency Act has required millions of small businesses to navigate a complex new federal compliance system, often for the first time. Unfortunately, bad actors are using the requirements of the rule to exploit business owners through phishing emails, fraudulent websites, and scam calls impersonating FinCEN. I applaud the Trump administration for scaling back its harmful requirement, recognizing the disproportionate burden and security risks that this rule has placed on small businesses, but there are still bad actors we must protect small businesses and entrepreneurs from. So, Mr. Brabant, how has FinCEN's BOI reporting requirements opened up small businesses to the threat of fraud and scams, and how can Congress better protect small business owners from BOI-related fraud?
Thank you, Congressman. The first one I discussed earlier is filing scams themselves. When you do a Google search, the first several results are not going to be from FinCEN. They're going to be from BOIR.org, who has what looks to be a government seal with an eagle in it. And some of these sites are charging $400 to file, and then small business owners have no idea if their information's actually being filed. And then, of course, there is the question of when you have a copy of your driver's license in a database, and there's tens of millions of driver's licenses in there, it's only a matter of time until that information is leaked or hacked, and that opens up significant identity theft risks.
Thank you. I've got limited time, but Mr. McLaughlin, could you elaborate on how the current filing burden of SARs and CTRs are affecting community banks, and how can Congress provide financial institutions some relief from these burdens while still giving law enforcement the information and tools that they need?
Thank you for your question. I think the burden needs to be shifted to a risk-based approach that's in an alignment between regulatory agencies, law enforcement, and the financial institutions. Check-the-box exercises are a drain on resources across the industry, and it's demoralizing to the institution, the folks that I represent, that we are not focusing on the threat, the real threat to our customers, but rather we are taking part in check-the-box exercises to get the machine of filing SARs or CTRs out within the regulatory expected SLAs.
Okay, thank you. I have Leah my time back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman, and the gentleman from Illinois, who's the ranking member of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee, Mr. Foster, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses. I'd like to talk a little bit about identity fraud and particularly the role of digital identity systems and maybe ameliorating some of that. You know, states like Louisiana are using digital driver's license to keep kids off porn websites and things like that. And so I guess my first question, Ms. Stokes, what fraction of the frauds really at some point against seniors involve identity fraud, where someone's representing themselves online as someone who they're not?
Oh, thank you for that question, Representative. It kind of goes two ways. So identities that have been stolen and used fraudulently can be used for a whole range of things. But when we're talking about what's happening online, people don't need a stolen identity to pretend who they are. I mean, it's too easy. You can create.
So I guess, yeah, the question is that if it became sort of standard practice when someone contacts you, sends you an email, text message, contacts you with social media, to just give a little token that says, here is the proof that I am the legally traceable person. You know,
Yes, thank you, Representative. And there are activities underway in the industry to try to come to that, and I would think that would benefit everybody.
Yeah, just, it seems like when, you know, I guess, one of you mentioned the error message on the screen that sort of triggered a big relationship that was just completely fraudulent. And if it became standard practice, and then you can contact me, someone can send me an anonymous text, and I'll just assume it's coming from some AI-generated trash. But if they're willing to identify themselves, then I'll pick it up even if I don't recognize the name. And it seems that's a much healthier way to end up with this wave of identity fraud that we're seeing. Now, another thing, a lot of you have mentioned the need to catch this at the front door and the use of technology. And one of the new pieces of technology that may become important are these AI personal assistants and companions that are really, in some cases, you know, even simple robots that seniors fall in love with when they get into memory care situations. Or just, you know, the taxi driver I know spends his day in conversation with an AI, asking him questions about, you know, sports scores or how the wildfire's doing. And it seems like an entity like that, if properly designed and regulated, could be sort of looking over the shoulder of elders as they're on the internet and saying, hey, you know, this AI personal assistant, which is being rolled out by dozens of AI companies, could, if done right, really be the first line of defense against this. And is anyone aware of something like this that is under development or being marketed that way?
Thank you, Representative. I'm not aware of those. I'm sure that's out there, but we have grave concern about the misuse of generative artificial intelligence.
Well, this would be an AI on your side. Right? This would be a product provided to that person whose job it was to defend that person against the wave of garbage out, AI-generated garbage on the internet. And so it seems like there may be something there, and it would be an interesting project for a nonprofit, for example, or just a company to think about developing, because that, you know, what you'd really love is that if every senior on the planet had a benevolent, you know, advisor looking over their shoulder and saying, you know, I'm very familiar with the millions of frauds that exist. And what you just are getting here on your screen looks a whole lot like a fraud I've seen 1,000 times before. And that can be done, it seems, with properly regulated AI assistance. And it seems like that's a real opportunity. So any thoughts you had on that or anything that you're aware of being developed, I'd be interested. So let's see, I guess Representative Vargas made the point I wanted to make about the tension between knowledge sharing and privacy. Because when you're talking about knowledge, you're talking about knowledge of things where there's no warrant and not necessarily probable cause, but if you see the whole picture, you can assemble the probable cause. And it seems like that's very sensitive legal grounds, you know, legal territory, to try to figure out how to strike that balance. We have to make sure that as politicians, we're not sort of making too inconsistent requests of whatever legal system we set up for that. Anyway, I guess that's, last quick question. What fraction of the Bybit hack money has been recovered, the $1.5 billion North Korean? What fraction has been successfully laundered?
Thank you for the question. I'm not familiar with the current stats. This is an ongoing investigation, but Chainalysis has aided the recovery of $40 million to date of that.
Okay, but at 1.5, big part of it has been successfully laundered and is lost forever. Is that correct?
It is ongoing, sir.
All right, thank you. Yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Kim, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. You know, recently I've been really concerned about the role that the Wayone Group plays in cyber scam operations. Ms. Cohen, I know that Chainalysis played a very sizable role in exposing the group's illicit activity. So can you break down what exactly your research found?
Thank you for the question. So we've been tracking Huihuan for a long time, and since 2021, Huihuan has processed $70 billion worth of cryptocurrency. Huihuan Guarantee operates as a peer-to-peer marketplace, allowing vendors and buyers to connect. It receives a fee from those transactions, and these vendors are nakedly selling scam materials, social media accounts, money mule services, and Huihuan also offers an exchange capacity. And it is the one-stop shop for scammers, giving them everything they need to conduct scams at scale for cheap.
You know, those that are critics of blockchain often paint it as a technology existing primarily to launder money or for other illicit activities. However, they fail to realize that the transparency that comes with a digital ledger can make it easier to identify and shut down bad actors. So, Ms. Cohen, how did you leverage blockchain technology in your investigation? In what way, group?
So the blockchain reveals a very detailed story about Huihuan, way more granularity than we would ever have from traditional financial institution investigations. And it paints a very vivid picture of its illicit exposure. We see many of our scams are using Huihuan as a common denominator, the common place to launder, cash out funds, but also reinvest the proceeds of scams for additional materials used to target additional victims. And it provides a very powerful tool for financial institutions that leverage our platform for transaction monitoring, as well as investigative law enforcement to understand its inner workings.
So as we try to shut down organizations like the Huihuan group, do you think sanctions are effective tool?
Sanctions are certainly a powerful tool, and one tool in the toolbox. I think more clarity would enable financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses that leverage our data to understand if and when they have exposure, whether they have customers sending to or receiving funds from Huihuan. It essentially cuts Huihuan off from the mainstream crypto ecosystem.
Could you give us an example of how this was actually used and it was sanction was being effective?
Sanctions have been most effective when coordinated with law enforcement. That 1-2 punch of not only designations, but also takedowns. Just last month, Garantex, which is a sanctioned Russian service, persisted despite sanctions. Certainly, any cryptocurrency business with receiving from or to Garantex has the ability to block those transactions effectively. Mm-hmm. And what we're now examining is, because Garantex has been blacklisted, it's potentially rebranded. But it allows us to follow the money trail to identify that next iteration. Even when they're in jurisdictions that are not compliant with Western law enforcement, we can still impose cost, we can inject friction.
Thank you. You know, I want to shift gears now and focus on the burden that suspicious activity reports have become on community financial institutions. So, Mr. McLaughlin, I want to ask you the questions. For community banks that have smaller regulatory teams, how much harder is it to complete the SARs with the level of details that is required?
Thank you for your question. So the burden on a smaller financial institution versus a larger institution is greater. At a larger financial institution, there's an investment in automation and other ways to make the investigative process and the SAR filing or CTR filing process more automated and faster. At the community bank or smaller financial institution level, the burden is on the person. The person has to basically write the who, what, where, when, how, and why the activity took place, and in great enough detail so that we're turning over SARs to the law enforcement that is considered actionable intelligence. We do not like getting feedback that we need to amend SARs or things like that to provide more data. So we look to provide as much data up front so that law enforcement can take it, but it is a very burdensome process because at that level of institution, there's not a lot of automation that takes place.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thanks, Ms. Kim. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McLaughlin, first I just want to state the obvious. You currently have systems in place, right, to block, freeze, reject any transactions and report them to OFAC if they're done by shady characters, sanctions evaders, child traffickers. Is that a broad yes?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm glad to hear it. You'd be in trouble if you said anything else. Tomorrow, the committee is going to mark up stablecoin legislation, which would include language to treat stablecoin issuers as financial institutions under the Bank Secrecy Act, in which case they would also have to comply with anti-money laundering, know your customer rules that you comply with as well. Is it your view that that stablecoin issuers should be subject to those same rules that you comply with, regardless of how those rules may change, that the rules shouldn't be different from one financial institution to another?
Thank you for your question. Yes, sir, I do believe any product, service, industry, or technology that is responsible for moving funds between customers or citizens has to be subject to regulation to make sure that they're protecting the customers or country.
Okay, and since you've presumably got some experience filing SARS reports and what have you, can you speculate on what the bad guys would do if we had a stablecoin regime where all of a sudden they weren't subject to the same rules that a depositor at your institution is subject to?
Thank you again. I could speculate that the bad guys would become even more aggressive in the space in terms of targeting vulnerable individuals to defraud, steal, and abuse the customers of the stablecoin.
Well, I certainly agree. I'm glad to hear you say it. And I raise that because some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle believe that stablecoin issuers should not have to comply with anti-money laundering rules. And I guess if you're here to represent our nation's child traffickers, that's a good position to have. But I think it's important that we make sure that we keep those protections. Ms. Coven, I want to move to you just to think about what might happen if we don't have those protections in place. My understanding from your from Chainalysis 2025 crime report is that stablecoins account for 63% of all illicit transactions that you had tracked, and that sanctioned entities are increasingly using stablecoins because of the difficulty of using the US dollar. Do I have that basically right on what your 2025 report said?
Yes, sir. Stablecoins have become the currency of blockchains. They are by far the most transacted cryptocurrency today. And we support efforts to establish regulatory frameworks across stablecoin issuers. Robust, consistent standards across this growing market can ensure.
I appreciate that, but I just want to focus on the 63% of the illicit activity is done on stablecoins. And I want to understand that number because my understanding of what you can track is that you can't see the off-chain transactions, right?
Correct.
So it's 63% of the stuff that's trackable, but presumably if the bad guys know what's trackable, it might be more than 63% if you could track everything.
As an investigator, for me personally, it is a gift when illicit actors decide to dabble in stablecoins because of the traceability and also seizability midstream.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, I love the guy who robs 7-Eleven without a mask and holds his ID up to the camera before he pulls the gun out, right? But presumably there's more there. Now, I say that because if I am a bad guy and we don't regulate stablecoins, I can imagine a scenario where I go on to, I buy some other kind of crypto, I use that to launder money, I then bring that onto an exchange that's issuing the stablecoin, convert it to stablecoin. Those are all off-chain transactions, so you wouldn't see any of that, right? If that was the means of money laundering?
We've still had spectacular seizures, including a $225 million seizure of stablecoins associated with the scam fund. So scammers know it's visible and traceable, but are still taking the risk to dabble in it.
No, and I'm not saying this to criticize Chainalysis. I'm just saying that because you're not tracking the off-chain, if I bought another crypto, went on to an exchange where the exchange was issuing this, because the exchanges run their own ledgers, right? And so you don't see that stuff, right?
Yes,
and that's like, I mean, you'd mentioned Guarantex earlier, but my understanding is that like Guarantex loves Tether because they can do all that sort of stuff and bypass the system. And even though hopefully we're clamping down on Guarantex, you could still do that inside other exchanges and not track that, right?
Absolutely. That's why regulatory frameworks that put standards on those cryptocurrency businesses to understand all the swapping that's
Okay.
going on
Well,
are imperative.
I really appreciate your expertise. I'm out of time, and just a marker for tomorrow, let's make sure we don't make things easier for the bad guys. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Ogles, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses. A new landscape is developed before us, and the bad actors have clearly figured out a way to thrive in that environment. So I want to go back to Huawei One. Up until January, Apple and Google, users on those two platforms could access. So Ms. Coven, when you look forward to One, what is currently the accessibility for Americans or Westerners to that platform and other platforms that may pose similar risks?
Yes, so we're seeing scam syndicates primarily leveraging these compounds. Huawei guarantee continues to be the common denominator for the majority of scams that we see, and including the laundering of scammed proceeds, as well as facilitating the tools and services needed to perpetrate the scam. Identities and data to contact and reach out to Americans for targeting of these confidence and pig butchering scams.
So if you could wave a magic wand, what would be your fix? What would be the defense, that firewall that we put up here to protect the end user, the Americans, from this type of scamming activity?
So Chainalysis has flagged Huawei in our product so that financial institutions with exposure to Huawei can make risk-based decisions on funds going to or coming from that platform. More regulatory pressure on institutions that are flagrantly abusing or flouting regulatory norms is important. Closing those gaps for AML standards is important because this jurisdictional arbitrage is certainly occurring.
Now, obviously, this is focused in China, but what about, are there other nation states that you have concerns about who are doing similar or learning from other bad actors and scaling up to, quite frankly, abuse Americans? My apologies.
Certainly, if Huawei didn't exist, there would be other jurisdictions, other services ready to take its place. And so we need to continue to use blockchain analytics to understand where these funds are going and where the illicit users wind up having success laundering funds.
Well, back to this platform, when you look at the child trafficking that's taking place and the movement of dollars, there's been, again, the bad actors have leveraged this technology to monetize the abuse of individuals, but in particular children. Again, what are next steps in combating that, being more aggressive in that space as this is becoming really a plague of our society?
So these scams are operated by organized criminal syndicates involved in not only scamming, but gambling, child trafficking, sex trafficking, and being able to find those centers of gravity, inject operational friction, deprive them of funds, the seizing funds, and also being able to cause them to be a pariah in the ecosystem is incredibly important. But we need that blockchain analytic capability to understand where the funds are going and identify those behind it.
So in other words, go after the money at the end of the day, right?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd love to get, when you talk about the regulatory regime that our colleague from the other side, I'd love to get your thoughts over the next my remaining time on what you envision as a regulatory regime for stablecoin, and quite frankly, the caution that we must, how we must proceed with caution, and so that we don't disrupt a marketplace that can be a benefit to the market, but at the same time, understanding that there's victims in the process.
Yeah, I think thanks for the dialogue here, but I think Mr. Kasten's concerns about illicit finance are well placed, and it highlights that the technology is changing. Stable coins are a little different way, and that's why our witness from Chainalysis, I think you did a great job answering. Hey, we like when things are on chain. We can follow it even easier. And when I'm talking about the things in my other committee in Foreign Affairs, a lot of the things that we're looking at with non-state actors that are, circumventing our sanctions, which are things our committee does. Doing those kinds of things on chain are more traceable in a lot of ways. That's exactly what we want. Sometimes we don't even want to turn off the flow of cash immediately. We want to be able to follow the flow so that we can actually target, in the case of warfare, kinetic targets. And then in the case of going after organized crime, we don't necessarily want the guy working out of mom's basement. We want to know who he's reporting to. And so the question is, are those tools better? We're going to talk about that in a lot of ways. Thanks, Mr. Ogles. The gentleman's time's expired, and he's yielded. And the gentleman from California, Mr. Liccardo, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for all this information. The hearing, of course, is captioned "Follow the Money," and I used to be involved in prosecuting drug traffickers and human trafficking as a federal prosecutor and later as a DA. And certainly I had plenty of challenges following the money when we knew there was information being provided by entities that was false, that would conceal who the actors were and who was controlling them, and most importantly, who was getting the money from the criminal enterprise, because we knew those were the folks who were really running the show. I'll give you a quick example. I remember a Cuban national who was controlling a major human trafficking enterprise in Southern California, of course, using entirely U.S. corporations filed under California and other states' laws with U.S. citizens, essentially, ostensibly being their officers. So I'm concerned, as I know the National District Attorneys Association is also concerned, based on what we see from their statement in December of 2024, at this legislation that we're currently considering that would exempt every U.S. corporation under a certain threshold size from Corporate Transparency Act's requirements providing basic basic ownership information to FinCEN. And let's be clear about what that information is under the law. It's the name of the owner, their date of birth, their address, and some identifying number from a driver's license or passport or some other government. That's it, 4 items. Now, in my experience, certainly trying to get the identity of those individuals controlling these entities that are engaged in criminal activity was pretty important. And I guess I just wanted to ask Stokes, does it help, based on your experience, to be able to have this kind of information if we're trying to combat fraud?
Thank you, Representative. Absolutely, the information is critical. And I just want to point out that we've heard a lot about concerns of administrative burden and concerns of data privacy. I want to turn to the burden of the victim. When you look in the aggregate of how much has been stolen just in 2023, an estimate from the FTC, $158.3 billion. That is 3 times the revenue of the Coca-Cola Company. We have to understand that, yes, there are burdens on businesses, and maybe some could be put together better than others, but we can't be moving away from rules that help protect consumers.
I agree, Ms. Stokes. And in fact, I believe Mr. Brabant suggested somehow or another corporations have to hire CPAs and outside counsel to be able to submit this information about the name of the owner, the date of birth, address, and their basic, driver's license number. Is that your experience, that you need outside counsel to do such things?
Thank you, Representative. I can't speak to that because that's not the space I work in, but I hear your point.
Yeah, so $153 billion in loss.
$158 billion.
$158 billion. Thank you for that. Mr. Brabant, you might have guessed I was going to you next. I'm trying to understand why providing these 4 basic pieces of information, which, by the way, I had to provide when I opened an LLC last year. Any bank would require it. It's pretty basic information. What is the extraordinary burden involved here?
It's also a photocopy of a driver's license, but it's that information. The challenge is the substantial control prong. And I think one thing that's getting lost here is that every bank already has this. So this is a duplication of the customer due diligence rule, which already exists. So every single LLC that has a bank, if the bank is doing its job, they have this information. What this is really
What happens if the
FBI
bank has
doesn't want it to be-
individuals who are involved in the criminal activity? Wouldn't you want that information in the hands of those who are investigating criminal activity, not those who may be
Anyone
complicit?
who's investigating could subpoena the bank for it at any time.
And what happens if you're just investigating for the first time? And you actually need to know who you can subpoena. You don't know exactly where to go because you don't have ownership information to begin with. I mean, you raise concerns, for example, about criminal threats to these companies, but in fact, the law is very clear under Title 31. Penalties only accrue if you're fraudulently reporting this information, willfully and fraudulently reporting information that is false. And somehow or another, you've cast this as some kind of great criminalization of corporate America. How can that be?
That's a knowing and willing standard, which is usually in the eye of a prosecutor.
Not knowing and willing. It says willfully provide false or fraudulent. That's what the statute says. Not knowing, it says willfully. Let's be very clear about what the statute says.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
The gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Salazar, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. My name is Maria Salazar. I represent the District Number 27 in Florida, which includes the city of Miami. And for what I've been studying, my hometown was ranked #1 in the nation with the highest per capita fraud in the country. That cost Floridians over $850 million. That is, and Miami is a great place, but this is pretty embarrassing. So I would like to ask Mr. McLaughlin if you could please explain to us why, according to the FTC fraud report, Miami is #1 in the nation for reported fraud. Why is that? Thank you, Mr. McLaughlin.
Thank you for your question. I
Yes.
can't really answer as to why Miami in particular is ranked #1, but I can tell you that the financial institutions today that I've had the honor of working with and partnering with have dedicated time, energy, and more importantly, resources to developing upfront detection of fraud. However,
Is there any specific reason why that area in the country, specifically the city of Miami, is the #1 in the country for fraud? What are we attracting?
If I would have to take a guess, it is the population of the potential vulnerable population that resides within the state of Florida. Also, the availability of being able to reach Miami from a foreign country also would probably play a part in that, having the ability to contact an elder in Miami and talk about investment opportunities maybe in their home country. It exists greater than in other large areas of the country. Again, that's just me taking a guess using my experience over time, but my fellow witnesses may have a better answer than I do.
Maybe Mrs. Coven, would you like to give us maybe your opinion as to why the city that I represent is #1 for fraud in the country?
I'm unfamiliar with Miami in particular, but from my experience, scammers are targeting Americans indiscriminately and are looking to develop relationships with individuals over texts and social media, and very happy to have their hands on American data to strike up those conversations, because America is a target-rich environment. It is a wealthy country, and it makes it a prime target for these fraudsters.
So any additional tools, any of you that would like to share with us, any additional tools or ideas that we should consider in order to stop this or make it a lot harder for these scammers to attack our constituents?
If I may, Representative?
Of course.
One of the points that was made a little bit earlier, I think the targeting does have a lot to do where older populations are. And if you broaden your look beyond Miami, you'll see probably the top 5 states are where the highest number of older adults live. It's not that they just target older adults, but when they get the older adult, there's a much bigger payout because they have the assets, right? So that's one thing. Another thing is that, this is organized crime, and our system of law enforcement just isn't resourced or isn't able, because of other competing demands, to look at these crimes through an organized crime lens. And if you did, you would get the $10,000 grandparent scam in Miami connected to the $10,000 grandparent scam in Tennessee, and all of a sudden, it's $1 million threshold breaking case. And there's a new initiative underway that will launch in April that's going to do just this, the National Elder Fraud Coordination Center. And I'd love to tell you more about that if you're interested.
Yeah, well, so that basically what you're telling us is that we are going to be honing on and targeting the senior population to explain to them or to send the message to be very careful. So that means that our seniors do not understand that they are the number one prey for this type of scammers.
Thank you, Representative. I can tell you my job is to educate older Americans, and within 2 years of doing this, I realized we cannot educate our way out of this. And NFC isn't about educating, it's about pulling data together from the private and public sectors
And
to
we
solve.
cannot educate them. Could you,
No.
I mean, my time is up, but just give me 30 seconds. Why do you think education is not the way to go with the senior population?
We've been saying education is the answer for years, and where are we? The $158.3 billion, $61.5 billion of which was stolen from older adults in 2023. It can't work on its own, and because we've relied on that, it's served to deprioritize any other activity that could have gone to mitigate the loss that's now growing so meteorically.
Thank you. You back.
Thank you. Appreciate the dialogue there. And the gentlewoman from Michigan, the chairwoman, also the chairwoman of the full Republican Conference, Ms. McLean from Michigan, is now recognized.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. This is a really important topic, I think, and something that I think we really need to figure out how to get our arms around. So again, appreciate for you holding the hearing as well as talking about this. I want to start with Ms. Coven. And I'm trying to understand blockchain, the role it plays, but could blockchain analytics or other technological solutions, so to speak, streamline the filing and analysis of SARs and CTRs? And if the answer is yes, which I hope it is, could you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, thank you for the question. Blockchain analytics already is enriching SAR and CTR quality. Our customers from private sector are leveraging the insights from our data to file their SARs and CTRs today. It paints a very vivid picture of the entire kill chain of events. So if we're talking about scams in particular, you have a much vivid color of where the funds are going and coming from, counterparties as well, much more so than you would in the traditional financial industry.
And is the timing a lot quicker as well, I'm assuming?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct. Cryptocurrency is an attractive asset for legitimate uses as well as illicit for its speed.
I mean, in my opinion, we have all these government or agencies and we have these rules and regulations, and at times they're so cumbersome and at times overburdening for the businesses where I think the businesses are trying to do the right thing and people are trying to do the right thing. It's just the volume is so immense, right, that it just takes time to go through that. So one of the biggest advantages I see, and I'd like to get your opinion on this, is the time, because to your point, the timing is crucial on when we find these. Could you talk a little bit about the timing of this and the time frame, how the time frame is shortened?
Yes, so we also provide real-time transaction monitoring, allowing financial institutions to get alerts on funds incoming or going off their platform, and they can be alerted in real time to these funds. So really time is at the essence, and current processes, reporting, information sharing is painfully slow. And even though cryptocurrency and the blockchain enable tracing and freezing, time is really at the essence. We have to make sure that those insights are delivered in a timely fashion.
Do you have any measurables on that?
No, ma'am, I do.
Okay, all right, Just curious, thank you. Mr. McLaughlin, how can FinCEN improve its communication and feedback mechanisms with banks and blockchain analytics firms following SARS and CTR submissions? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, and thank you for your question. Everybody could probably tell, the point of a lot of the things I've said today is creating an open and transparent two-way communication between the public and private sector so that we could begin focusing the resources that we have on the threats that our customers face on a daily basis. So working with FinCEN to establish a working group or a task force or whatever terminology you want to throw at it, would allow us to begin establishing and doing data analytics on what the government is seeing, what law enforcement is seeing, and what the private sector is seeing, so that we can begin putting pen to paper on what a true risk-based approach means for financial crimes across the board: fraud, money laundering, sanctions, and terrorism finance.
Are you getting any pushback or running into any roadblocks on that?
I wouldn't say roadblocks or pushback. I think with the increased scrutiny that all of you are bringing to light today, I do think we are seeing across the industry a knowledge sharing exercise taking place, whether that be informally or formally, but more work is needed. I think when we look at things like the FFIEC manual and the revisions there, I do think a public, private, and law enforcement type engagement would allow us to put down what the actual requirements are, so that we could point to the crimes that we're trying to capture.
And are you getting any pushback on that public-private partnerships?
Personally, with the folks that I work with, no, it's just not official. It's it's at outside the hallways here or at a convention or a conference that knowledge sharing really exists.
Thank you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Iowa is also the vice chairman of the committee. Mr. Nunn is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for putting this important hearing together today. We all know that in my home state of Iowa, in the heart of the heartland, my senior citizens are probably target number one for the scams. It's happening across not just Iowa, but the entire country. I'm proud to say that the U.S. is also probably the best place for innovators to come to the forefront and really be the superheroes in the story of fighting back. In November, the Department of Justice used blockchain to freeze approximately $225 million that were used in a human trafficking scheme. However, even amongst this technological situation, we remain challenged for most of our state and local law enforcement entities to get an opportunity to play, as Mr. McLaughlin, you just highlighted. One victim back in my hometown in Iowa, a 68-year-old veteran, lost over $100,000 to a scam. Challengingly, local law enforcement couldn't even begin to help. That's why today, Mr. Chair, I'm introducing the bipartisan GUARD Act to give state and local law enforcement agencies access to the technology they need to combat these financial fraud, crimes, and pig butchering scams. So let's get started on this. Ms. Cohen, I know that you and I are on the same page here because in your testimony, you emphasize the need to train more people on things like blockchain, those digital rails in which the future of technology is going to operate on here in the United States. This is exactly what the GUARD Act, my bill, attempts to accomplish. So I understand that your company has trained people on these technologies, both at the state and even down to the local level. Can you briefly walk us through some of the examples and if there's been stories of success here?
Yes, thank you for the question, and I'm sorry to hear about your constituent being defrauded. It's a story we hear all too often, unfortunately. At Chainalysis, though, we do work with over 70 state and local governments around the country, and we have seen astounding successes when law enforcement is trained and equipped properly. And we have only scratched the surface, unfortunately. And particularly with the proliferation of these types of scams, we need to better equip state and local law enforcement to understand how to handle these cases and connect a single fraud victim to a wider network and increase chances of disruption and recovery.
Jackie, I think you really highlight a point here that this has happened in the physical world before, and we've had good game plans to go after it. You know, what our GUARD Act bill is aiming to do is to create these fusion centers of best practices at the federal level, marry them up with local law enforcement agencies, and provide those level of resources to really go after that so that, you know, an Iowan who loses 100,000 or a New Yorker who loses 1 million all have the same access to the same resources. Is this what you've seen through your experience to be a successful solution?
Yes, sir. We should have every advantage because these scammers are leveraging cryptocurrency, but time is at the essence. And what we have seen in working groups and small-scale operations is that when private and public sector are together, sharing information dynamically, we can turn that wealth of information into actionable insights quickly and have stunning successes.
Thank you, Ms. Cohen. Ms. Stokes, I want to thank you and your incredible team at AARP. You're on the front line not only guarding our seniors, but you've helped bridge this to be a bipartisan effort. Our GUARD Act is really brought together by Mr. Gottheimer and myself, a Republican and a Democrat, really working for the best interests of the American people here. I'd like to, one, ask how could retirees benefit from a local law enforcement that would have access to these greater tools that a GUARD Act could provide so they can get to know about blockchain, understand how financial fraud works, and really address the sources of these crimes to stop the number of victims we're seeing.
Thank you, Representative, and AARP is very proud to support the GUARD Act. I think it's critical. We talk to probably 100,000 victims a year, maybe 500 calls a day, and the vast majority of fraud victims where money has been stolen, they have no recourse. They'll call local or state police, and even if police that they talk to understand that it's a crime, they'll still say, there's nothing we can do about it. And sometimes don't even take the report, which is a challenge in and of itself. So anything that we can do to not only provide the tools, but importantly to train local and state law enforcement on things that they simply don't have the training on right now would be of great benefit to our constituency.
Well, thank you, Ms. Stokes. I want to again say thank you to AARP for helping lead this because it's not only my seniors who want this, it's every American who needs this, and no one more so than my local law enforcement who want to be able to help our own community get better. This gets us in the right direction. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I yield the remainder of my time.
I thank you very much. I thank all of our witnesses and our colleagues for a great hearing today. Kind of scary what's going on for the citizens of this country. Hopefully this will help make a difference. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions to the witnesses and to the chairman for questions. Witnesses, please, if you get those, respond no later than May 6th. And this hearing is now adjourned.